December 17th, 1944. Before dawn had even considered rising over the frozen Belgian countryside, an eerie stillness settled around the armoured column of Kampfgruppe Peiper. The quiet was broken only by the choking gasp of a Tiger tank's engine as it fought for life, then surrendered. The Maybach motor coughed, rattled, and finally went silent, as if the cold itself had strangled it. From inside the turret, SS Standartenführer Joachim Peiper burst upward, shoving open the hatch with a metallic crash that sliced through the pre-dawn air. His gloved fist slammed against the armour in frustration. The driver had tried restarting the engine repeatedly, but the gauges told the whole story. The Tiger wasn't suffering mechanical failure. It was starving. Both the main and reserve tanks were empty. Peiper dropped to the ground, his boots crushing the brittle frost that coated the earth. Stretching out before him in the dim light was the spearhead of what Hitler promised would be a decisive counterblow, the Ardennes Offensive. 67 tanks, nearly 150 half-tracks, and around 5,000 Waffen-SS troops stood frozen in the darkness, not because of the cold, but because every drop of fuel that should have powered this armoured fist was gone. Through the mist, Peiper made out the outlines of Hansfeld, the American position they had seized only hours earlier. The US troops had fled in such haste that the camp still breathed with their presence. Coffee still steamed in metal mugs scattered among the trenches. Half-burnt logs crackled in barrels the Americans had left behind. And then, far more stunning than abandoned food or warmth, Peiper saw them, rows and rows and rows. Hundreds, no thousands of American jerry cans, neatly stacked, stretching almost absurdly across the depot, olive-drab containers packed with the one substance Germany no longer possessed in meaningful quantity, fuel. Peiper walked toward the field of cans slowly, almost reverently, like a pilgrim approaching a shrine. His adjutant pried open one of the containers and inhaled sharply. High-grade American gasoline, cleaner, more powerful, and more plentiful than anything German crews had touched in months. At once, the quiet of dawn shattered as Peiper's men scattered throughout the depot, yanking open lids, dragging hoses, and frantically refueling their paralyzed machines. Engines sputtered back to life. Tigers and panthers growled again. But Peiper's attention drifted elsewhere, not to the momentary relief of restored mobility, but to the numbers. He paced the perimeter of the depot, counting, recalculating, doing the grim arithmetic of war. 50,000 gallons, sitting untouched. More fuel than most German divisions had received during half a year of fighting. Enough to push his battle group toward the Meuse River. Enough to give hope to an offensive that had been doomed the moment it began. Yet instead of triumph, Peiper felt a tightening in his chest. If the Americans could abandon such quantities, if they could walk away from what Germany needed to survive, then this war was being fought on terms the Third Reich could never match. Far away, 6 months earlier, Albert Speer had warned Hitler that German synthetic fuel production was collapsing. Allied bombing had pulverized the hydrogenation plants that transformed coal into liquid fuel, Germany's last lifeline. Facilities that once produced hundreds of thousands of tons per month were reduced to a fraction of their output. Romanian oil fields were drying up or captured. Transport networks were shattered. Fuel was evaporating from the Reich's war effort as surely as if someone had punched holes in every barrel. In contrast, American oil wells pumped relentlessly. In 1944 alone, the United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude, more than 50 times what Germany could muster, even after scraping together every drop of synthetic production and seized Romanian supplies. It was like trying to fight a tidal wave with a bucket. Still, Hitler demanded an offensive, and so the Wehrmacht gave Peiper barely 31,000 gallons of fuel, enough for perhaps 50 miles of hard combat, despite knowing his objective lay 65 miles away. The rest would have to come from whatever he captured. It wasn't strategy, it was hope pretending to be strategy. Even before the fighting began, the imbalance was impossible to ignore. Not far from Peiper's start point, an American tank battalion casually noted in its morning log, "Fuel resupply received, storage full." That same day, US supply convoys and pipelines pumped more gasoline into Europe than the entire German offensive would consume. Peiper's advance on December 16th began under a hail of artillery meant to announce Germany's last great push. The bombardment used more shells in 2 hours than earlier campaigns had consumed in weeks. But even that spectacle disguised the truth. Ammunition was running low, fuel was running even lower. And Peiper's column, navigating roads that looked like highways on maps but were little more than icy farm trails, found itself mired in traffic jams within hours. Then came an absurd delay no planner had accounted for. 18 American reconnaissance troops, dug into a tiny village at Lanzerath, held up Peiper's entire spearhead for nearly 10 hours. Vehicles idled, fuel burned, time evaporated. By the time the Germans broke through and reached Hansfeld at dawn on December 17th, nearly 40% of their fuel was gone, and they had advanced just 20 miles. Hansfeld was supposed to be a minor point on the map. Instead, it became the clearest window into the real shape of the war. The depot was overflowing, so overflowing that American engineers hadn't even bothered to destroy it before retreating. Tigers, designed for rough 74-octane fuel, now guzzled American gasoline so pure it caused engine misfires. And then came the discoveries that truly rattled Peiper. Shipping manifests showed the gasoline had travelled from Texas to New York, across the Atlantic to Liverpool, then to Normandy, and finally hundreds of miles inland, arriving faster than Germany could move supplies across its own shrinking territory. Newspapers left behind casually mentioned a newly opened pipeline capable of pushing 300,000 gallons a day toward the front, more than Peiper's entire battle group might consume in the whole Ardennes campaign. Everywhere Peiper looked, the truth stared back. Germany was waging a war against an enemy that did not know scarcity, and the deeper Peiper went into Belgium, the more brutally obvious that truth became. What happened after Hansfeld did more than fuel Peiper's tanks. It shattered whatever illusions German planners still held about the nature of the enemy they faced. Fueled by the captured gasoline, Kampfgruppe Peiper surged westward with renewed momentum. They entered Billingen before noon, scooping up rations, ammunition, and, most importantly, American maps pinpointing even more fuel depots. But the maps also revealed something far more disturbing than additional supplies. Fuel wasn't scarce for the Americans. It wasn't even precious. It was everywhere. Every crossroads, every staging point, every forward unit had mountains of it stacked like firewood. The US First Army alone sat on reserves that dwarfed everything Germany had for the entire offensive. This abundance became even clearer when Peiper's column approached the massive depot at Stavelot, a fuel cache so large it could have carried his battle group not just to the Meuse, but beyond it. But Peiper arrived too late. Warned by scouts, American engineers had already begun preparations. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineers gave a simple order: deny them every drop. His men poured gasoline between piles of jerry cans, threw white phosphorus grenades, and stepped back. What followed looked like the sun erupting on Belgian soil. A wall of flame roared upward, the heat punching into the sky with terrifying force. Thousands of cans ignited in seconds. The fire grew to a pillar of black smoke rising 1,000 feet high, a signal to the entire Ardennes that Germany's last offensive was bleeding to death. For 3 days the inferno burned, consuming enough gasoline to power Peiper's division to Antwerp and back. Peiper's men stared into the flames in stunned silence. Then his driver turned to him and whispered the sentence that captured Germany's hopelessness better than any report ever would. They burn more fuel in minutes than we receive for an entire operation. How do we fight that? Across the Ardennes, similar scenes unfolded. At Trois-Ponts, 1.1 million gallons destroyed. At Spa, 2.5 million gallons went up in fire. In a single week, over 8 million gallons intentionally burned. Germany planned to capture fuel to survive. America treated fuel like a disposable resource. That difference, cultural, logistical, industrial, was the true front line of the Battle of the Bulge. While German tanks rationed every litre, American supply fleets moved constantly. The Red Ball Express alone consumed more fuel moving supplies than Army Group B received in a month, yet it never stopped delivering. 20,000 tons per day, thousands of trucks, all running on a steady river of gasoline. Pipeline networks like Pluto, Pipeline Under the Ocean, pumped 1 million gallons a day from England. Inland pipelines moved even more. By December 1944, Allied forces in northwest Europe consumed 7.5 million gallons a day while receiving over 8 million. They were gaining reserves while attacking. Meanwhile, Peiper was sliding into catastrophe. Tiger tanks gulped fuel at nearly 3 gallons per mile. Panthers a bit less, but the Ardennes terrain punished both. Snow, mud and altitude drove consumption 40% higher. By midday on December 18th, Peiper's battle group had burned through 67,000 gallons, while capturing only around 55,000. He was operating at a deficit during an offensive designed around momentum. As Peiper pressed deeper into the forest roads, ultra-intercepts revealed the German fuel crisis. American High Command immediately issued new orders: destroy all fuel stocks threatened by capture. And they meant it. Even surrounded units received absurd quantities of fuel. C-47 aircraft flew 316 sorties to Bastogne alone on December 18th, delivering more fuel to one encircled American town than Peiper had in his entire battle group. By December 19th, with fighting intensifying around Stoumont, Peiper's fuel situation collapsed entirely. Tanks were being abandoned not because of enemy fire, but because their engines sputtered out from starvation. Mechanics cannibalized empty vehicles just to keep a handful operational. And while his armored column began to crack apart, American generals calmly requested 250 million gallon monthly allocations. The request was approved instantly. Fuel, to the Americans, was simply another number on a chart. To the Germans, it was the difference between life and death. On December 20th, a final message reached Peiper: fuel convoy destroyed, no resupply possible. Peiper gathered his officers. One of them, SS Sturmbannführer Werner Poetschke, was brutally direct. We have fuel for 20 kilometers. The Meuse is 30. The offensive, the last card Hitler had already failed. From that point onward, Peiper wasn't advancing. He was bleeding out slowly, mile by mile. By December 21st, surrounded at La Glaise with fewer than 1,000 gallons remaining, Peiper listened to American radio chatter mocking the German predicament. One American soldier wrote home, "We use more fuel heating coffee than they have for tanks." It wasn't an exaggeration. It was the truth. On December 23rd, the weather cleared. Allied aircraft swarmed the skies, flying thousands of sorties. A single hour of P-47 operations consumed more aviation fuel than Germany allocated to the entire offensive. That night, Peiper made the final decision of his career. Abandon every vehicle. Escape on foot. 39 armored vehicles remained functional. Every one was destroyed with explosives or set ablaze. Millions of Reichsmarks turned into burning metal, not for tactical reasons, but because the fuel simply wasn't there. By the time Peiper's exhausted survivors slipped back through the forests, the reality of the Ardennes was undeniable. Germany hadn't been defeated by firepower. It had been defeated by math. The collapse of Kampfgruppe Peiper reverberated through the German High Command like a shockwave. The moment senior commanders saw the reports from Hansfeld and the infernos of Stavelot, they understood a truth Hitler refused to see. The war Germany thought it was fighting no longer existed. On December 26th, Field Marshal Walter Model studied the figures twice, then laid the documents down in silence. The numbers were surreal. 50,000 gallons captured by Peiper, 2 million gallons burned at Stavelot, over 8 million gallons destroyed across the front. His whispered conclusion became legendary. We are not fighting the same war as the Americans. But Hitler, presented with photographic evidence of the burning depots, dismissed it as enemy theatrics and Hollywood fabrication. He refused to believe the Americans had such abundance. The lower ranks, however, knew exactly what it meant. Letters smuggled home from the front told a story more devastating than battlefield defeat. German soldiers described Americans discarding half-eaten rations, washing their clothes with gasoline, burning barrels of fuel just to stay warm. Propaganda had told Germans that Americans were soft and decadent, but nothing in Nazi ideology had prepared them for a nation so rich in resources that it treated gasoline like water. The psychological effect was catastrophic. One captured German officer put it bluntly, "We measure fuel by the liter, they measure by the millions. We cannot fight infinity." By late 1944, the industrial scales of war were no longer balanced. They were collapsing under the weight of American production. The US manufactured half of the world's goods. It built an aircraft every 5 minutes, a cargo ship every day, a tank every 7 minutes. When it came to petroleum, the Allies possessed a 50-to-1 advantage over the Axis. Germany's fate was sealed long before Peiper reached Hansfeld. The pattern repeated across the collapsing front. Luftwaffe pilots lacked fuel for training. U-boats remained in port, unable to sail. Hospitals lost generator power. Ambulances couldn't move wounded soldiers. Entire panzer divisions surrendered because they had 40 tanks and only 300 litres of fuel. When interrogated after the war, German commanders admitted openly that the Ardennes Offensive was doomed from the start. One general stated, "After the Ardennes, we knew it was over. We had played our last card and discovered the enemy held the entire deck." In the spring of 1945, the final scenes were almost surreal. German tanks sat abandoned in fields, not destroyed in glorious last stands, but left to rust because there wasn't enough fuel to drive them even a few miles. American units advancing east complained not of enemy resistance, but of traffic jams caused by their own overwhelming number of vehicles. And through all this, the symbol of the Ardennes remained: the Tiger tank that ran dry at La Glaise. When veterans returned decades later, that very tank stood exactly where Peiper's men abandoned it in December 1944, a monument to the moment when tactical brilliance met logistical reality and utterly lost. One American veteran asked a former German crewman why they had stopped. The German laughed bitterly, "Because the tank was empty. You burned millions to deny us thousands. How could we fight that?" The American nodded quietly. "We never knew you were that short. We had so much we never thought about it." That short exchange captured the entire truth of December 1944. One army measured fuel by the gallon. The other measured it by oceans. The outcome had been decided before the engines ever started. In final analysis, the Battle of the Bulge wasn't merely a tactical failure. It was the moment Germany confronted the brutal arithmetic of industrial war. The Americans weren't just well supplied. They existed in a different reality altogether. Peiper himself later admitted, years before his assassination in France, finding that depot at Hansfeld was the worst thing. Had we run out earlier, we could have withdrawn with pride. Instead, we discovered the Americans had oceans while we had drops. We discovered impossibility. That impossibility is the lesson historians draw from the Ardennes. It wasn't courage or strategy or even firepower that decided the war. It was the unyielding force of production, the refineries, the pipelines, the factories. In the end, Peiper's captured 50,000 gallons amounted to 0.6% of a single day of American fuel consumption. What was a miracle for Germany was a rounding error for the Allies, and so the war ended not with a dramatic duel of armoured titans, but with tanks sitting cold and silent on the roads of Belgium, victims not of enemy guns, but of empty fuel tanks. A war decided by numbers, a war decided by industry, a war Germany never had the means to win.